The Norse have the Norns, the Hindus have the Tridevi, the Greeks have Hecate, and the Charities, and the Erinyes, and the Moirae, or Fates. The Romans have their versions of those too, namely Diana Triformis, the Gratiae, or Graces, the Furies, and the Parcae. The Romani people have the Ursatori. The Romanians have the Ursituara. The Gaulish, Celtic, and Germanic-speaking peoples of northwestern Europe had the Madres, mothers, and the Matronae, matrons, or at least that's what the Romans called them. Then we have the Gaelic/Goidelic Celtic speakers of Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. According to some practitioners of Irish and Celtic neo-paganism and neo-druidry, the Morrigan was, or is, their triple goddess. To quote the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, very early the Morrigan is understood to be a triple goddess. She is the triple source of power needed to regenerate cycles, to take one from life to death, and from death to life. End quote. So, case closed, right? Roll credits. As always, my name is I.E. Kneverday. Thanks for coming. Not so fast, because according to the Irish pagan school, quote, she is not a triple goddess. The Morrigan does not have a maiden, mother, and crone aspect or function. This is a notion which comes from modern Wicca and is not part of the Irish pagan tradition. So if people could stop saying it, that would be just great. End quote. Ruh-roh, looks like we've fluttered across a major mythological controversy, and I intend to set the record straight. First things first, the Morrigan is popularly understood to be a Celtic death goddess, but even that interpretation of the deity is contentious. For starters, Celtic isn't the best word to use here. Gaelic or Irish would be better. And while she is associated with death, the Morrigan could more accurately be described as a goddess of battle, fate, and territorial sovereignty. Indeed, you can often find her on the battlefield, either rousing soldiers to battle, or, depending on the myth, tormenting soldiers, both physically and mentally. In the Tonbo Culnia, Cattle Raid of Cooley, the Morrigan infamously transforms into a crow/raven, a slippery black eel, a rough gray-red female wolf, and a white hornless red-eared heifer with 50 heifers about her and a chain of silvered bronze between each two of the heifers. You know, the usual. Also, she can mess with the hero, Cuchulainn. Across all of her appearances in Irish mythology, the Morrigan has a habit of delivering prophecies and proclamations before and after bloody battles. She's sort of Irish mythology's color commentator, offering her predictions, giving the play-by-play, and then doing post-battle analyses. And as I mentioned in my video comparing the Norse and Irish pantheons, the Morrigan is a fierce warrior in her own right. Now, how does any of this point to the Morrigan being a triple goddess? I mean, it really doesn't. So where did this idea come from? For that, we'll need to go all the way back to Irish mythology's chronological beginning. The Yaur Gabhala Érenn, or the Book of the Taking of Ireland, commonly known as the Book of Invasions, details the consecutive arrivals of Ireland's 6 mythical races. That 5th race is the Tuatha Danann, Ireland's divine tribe, of which the Morrigan is a part. And here is the first reference to the Morrigan, aka Morrigu, in R.A.S. McAllister's translation of the Yaur Gabhala Érenn. Quote, Ernmas had other 3 daughters, Baive and Macha and Morrigu, whose name was Anand. End quote. Okay, so there we have the Morrigan listed as a part of a trio of sisters where she's also given the pseudonym Anand. And what's interesting is that earlier in that same text we find the following line, quote, Baive and Macha and Anand, of whom are the paps of Anu and Lucher, were the 3 daughters of Ernmas, the she-farmer. End quote. So it seems as though the conflation of the Morrigan with Anand/Anu was a later addition. And while some scholars consider that Anand/Anu is synonymous with the Irish goddess Dana/Danu, the possible namesake of the Tuatha Danann, the Yaur Gabhala Érenn has a separate entry for Danu that appears shortly after the Anand/Anu reference. And I quote, Danan, the daughter of Delba, was mother of Brian, Ucarva, and Uker. These were the 3 gods of Danu, from whom is named the Mountain of the 3 Gods. End quote. So clearly Danu is a separate goddess from Anand/Anu. right? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, because the name Danu doesn't actually appear in the original Old Irish. It's the hypothetical nominative form of the genitive Danan. But I digress. When we get to the second direct reference to the Morrigan in the Yawer Gabhaile Éireann, the Anand Anu moniker is entirely absent. Quote, Baive and Macha, greatness of wealth, Morrigu, springs of craftiness, sources of bitter fighting, were the three daughters of Ernmas. End quote. What do we make of all this? Is the Morrigan the same as Anan/Anu? Did she replace Anan/Anu? Because it turns out the connection between these two goddesses may determine whether or not the Morrigan qualifies as a triple goddess. In the Sanas Cormac, or Cormac's Glossary, which is popularly attributed to a 9th century Munster bishop and king, Anu is dubbed the, quote, mother of gods. Hence, it can be tempting to think, alright, here is the mother portion of the popular Maiden-Mother-Crone triple goddess archetype. So I guess that makes Baive, or Bav, which means crow, the crone, you know, like old crow. And since the name Macha is rooted in the Proto-Celtic Makaya, meaning flat area or plain, maybe that makes her the maiden. You know, like fertile plain. Although plains can be barren. What's more, the 9th century De Origina Scoticae Linguae, also known as O. Macalnery's Glossary, defines Macha as, quote, a scald crow/hooded crow, or she is the third Morrigan, whence Macha's mast, i.e., the heads of people after their slaughter. End quote. So does that mean Macha is the crone, since she's so closely associated with death? Also, it's unclear whether the third Morrigan label means Macha is the third aspect of a goddess, or that she is one of 3 Morrigan sisters. Fortunately, other texts can shed some light on this. In the first battle of Matura, which sees the Tuatha Dé Danann face off against the Fir Bolg, we find the following. Quote, it was then that Baive and Macha and Morrigan went to the knoll of the taking of the hostages, and to the hill of the summoning of hosts at Tara, and sent forth magic showers of sorcery, and compact clouds of mist, and a furious rain of fire, with a downpour of red blood from the air on the warriors' heads. End quote. Lovely. Later in that same text, we get this reference. Quote, the chiefs who went out in front of the Tuatha Dé on that day were Ogma, Midir, Bovderig, Diankate, and Angaba of Norway. The women, Baive, Macha, Morrigan, and Danan, offered to accompany them. End quote. Okay, so now we've got that fourth name thrown back into the mix. Robert Graves would attempt to square this circle in his seminal 1948 work, The White Goddess, in which he noted, quote, the Maleficent Anna was the leading person of the Fate Trinity, Anna, Baive, and Macha, together known as the Morrigan, or Great Queen. End quote. And while Great Queen is a widely promoted etymology for the Morrigan, the idea that the Morrigan is some overarching or composite deity made up of Baive, Macha, and Anna/Anu/Danan is not explicitly stated in the primary texts we've looked at so far. I'd argue a simpler explanation here is that the Great Queen title is exactly that. A title. And that would explain the somewhat awkward phrasing at the beginning of the Yawer Gabhaile Éireann. Ernmas had other 3 daughters, Baive and Macha and Morrigu, whose name was Anand. It makes more sense when you read it. Ernmas had other 3 daughters, Baive and Macha, and the Great Queen, whose name was Anand. This phrasing doesn't imply that Anand/the Morrigan is the queen of some triune or tripartite deity, but that amongst the Tuatha Dé Danann she is a queen. Hence, in the text, she's referred to interchangeably as Anand and Morrigu. It's your classic Daenerys Khaleesi scenario. But let's stop obsessing over the Yawer Gabhaile Éireann, shall we? Because there are other medieval Irish texts that have things to say about the Morrigan. In the Banshenhas, woman lore, or lore of women, we find the following titillating tidbit. Quote, Naemon, Danan, Bov, and Macha, Morrigu, who brings victory, impetuous and swift Aidan, Behuli of the North Country, were the sorceresses of the Tuired. End quote. So this passage clearly makes a distinction between the Morrigan, aka Morrigu, who brings victory on the battlefield, and 4 other sorceresses, Neman, Danand, Bolv, and Macha. But given how those 4 names precede the name Morrigu, it's easy to see how someone might combine them, either accidentally or intentionally, into a single entity. And we can see such a conflation in the story Togol Brian Da Durga, the destruction of Da Durga's hostel, which, like the Ban Shenhas, dates to the 12th century. Or at least that's when the earliest extant versions of those texts were recorded. Anyway, check out this exchange that takes place between the High King, Conera Mor, and a lone woman in a grayish woolly mantle with lips on one side of her head, lower hair that reaches as far as her knee, and shins as long as a weaver's beam and as dark as the back of a stag beetle. Quote, saith Conera, "It is not thou that always augurs for us. What is thy name, O woman?" "Caleb," she answers. "That is not much of a name," says Conera. "Lo, many are my names besides." "Which be they?" asks Conera. "Easy to say," quoth she. "Samon, Sinand, Sekland, Sov, Kael, Kal, Dihum, Dichul, Dihim, Diquivna, Dicridna, Darna, Darinya, Derunya, Egam, Agam, Ehamna, Nim, Cluicha, Keharda, Nith, Nemon, Nonen, Baiv, Blosk, Blor, He, Oa, Ifa, Lasrucha, Macha, Medech, Mod. End quote. Notably absent from that list, of course, is the Morrigan, or Morrigu, but given the figure's role in the story, that of an augur or prophetess, and those familiar names, Macha, Baiv, and Neman, it's hard to ignore a potential Morrigan connection. And for the triple goddess superfans out there, it's also hard to ignore the figure's crone-like appearance. Granted, shapeshifting is one of the Morrigan's signature superpowers, if you will, so if we accept that the Da Durga's hostile version of the Morrigan is her crone aspect, we also have to wonder, what aspects do the eel and the wolf and the heifer represent? Because those are all forms she takes in the Tanbo Kulnya, in addition to appearing as a crow/raven and as an old hag. If we left it here, I think the textual evidence, or lack thereof, would speak for itself. A plain reading of Irish mythology's primary sources that reference the Morrigan, namely the Tán, the Yawargawla Erin, Cormac's Glossary, Olmaconry's Glossary, the Ban Shenhas, the First Battle of Matura, and the destruction of Da Durga's hostel, don't directly support the goddess having a triple nature. But as I am wont to do, I've been saving the best evidence for last. In the second battle of Matura, which sees the Tuatha Dé Danann face off against the marauding Fomorians, we find the following passage, and I urge you to pay close attention to the pronouns being used here. Quote, "Then after the preparation for the battle had been settled, Lu and the Dagda and Ogma went to the 3 gods of Danu, and they gave Lu equipment for the battle. And for 7 years they had been preparing for them and making their weapons. Then she said to him, undertake a battle of overthrowing. The Morrigan said to Lu, awake." Then there's a gap in the text. At first glance, it might seem like the scribe is using the Morrigan, she, and the 3 gods of Danu, they, interchangeably. Or perhaps the switch to she is meant to indicate that now one of those 3 gods is speaking. The only problem with such interpretations is that we already know who the 3 gods of Danu are: Brian, Huharva, and Euchre. The Morrigan isn't one of them. Or all of them, for that matter. Regardless, the Morrigan has a larger role to play in the second battle of Matura, which includes getting frisky with the Dagda, the father of the Irish gods, on Samhain, or, quote, near the All Hallows of the battle, as Elizabeth A. Gray rendered it in her translation. This coupling has been the source of much speculation. For example, archaeologist Barry Cunliffe has asserted that the mythical union of the Morrigan and the Dagda was believed to be an annual occurrence meant to ensure that the Morrigan would spare the Tuatha Dé Danann from death and devastation, even though that's nowhere in the actual text. There's also the Wiccan/neo-pagan idea that the triple goddess's male counterpart is the horned god, and while the Dagda is never described as having Cernunnos-like horns or antlers, he does, on one occasion, jokingly refer to himself as Fear Ben, meaning the horned man or peaked man. But to be clear, this is on account of his aroused state, not because he has actual horns sprouting from his head. Of course, if you're keen on squeezing mythical Irish figures into archetypal molds, these textual tidbits might be enough to convince you that the Morrigan is a triple goddess. But you'd also have to ignore the fact that later in the Second Battle of Matura, after the battle is won and the slaughter is cleaned away, quote, the Morrigan, the daughter of Ernmas, gives a big speech. Meanwhile, Macha, the daughter of Ernmas, falls at the hands of Balor, as in Balor of the Evil Eye. This confirms what the other primary sources have been telling us all along. The Morrigan and Macha are sisters, not aspects of a triple deity. Hence, one sister is able to survive the battle, while the other kicks the bucket. Now, just to cover all of my bases, I know that in some neo-pagan circles, the three aspects of the triple goddess, Maiden, Mother, and Crone, are thought to correspond to birth, life, and death, and/or to the sky, the earth, and the underworld, and/or to the phases of the moon, waxing full and waning, and/or to the stages of womanhood, namely getting ready to make babies, making babies, and being a wise old grandma after the baby making is finished. Paraphrasing. A quick aside, if the whole Maiden-Mother-Crone trichotomy feels a bit icky, as it essentially ties divine female power to childbearing, that's a common and, in my mind, valid criticism. Alternate labels for the three aspects of the triple goddess have been proposed, including youth, warrior, and sage. And sure, we can cherry-pick details from the medieval Irish texts to have the Morrigan fit into either of those interpretations of the archetype, because the Morrigan does appear as a crone, and while she's not described as a mother, she does knock boots with the Dagda, and for the maiden part, I mean, she was ostensibly one at some point. Same goes for being a youth, and we know she's a warrior, and she certainly has sage-like characteristics in some of the myths. The problem with this approach, however, is we're not starting with the evidence and seeing where it leads us. We're starting with the archetype and trying to cram the Morrigan into it, an exercise we could do with virtually any mythical Irish woman. It's the same problem I described in my video on the Holly King and Oak King. When you're swinging around a big old archetype axe, everything starts to look like Sir Gawain's neck. But what do you think? Is the Morrigan actually a triple goddess? And if yes, what evidence can you point to that supports that claim? Go ahead and drop a comment below. A super thanks will get you a priority response. And if you're a folk horror fan, go check out my new channel, Folklore in Film, where I discuss movies like The Lighthouse and Midsummer. As always, my name is I.E. Kneverday, editor of the Celtic fantasy short story anthology Neon Druid, and creator of IrishMyths.com. Thanks for coming out.